My name is Fatma Müge Göçek. I'll be chairing this panel, and we do have 4 presenters. And we will be starting with a presentation by Efrem Yıldız from the University of Salamanca, Spain. And the title of his presentation is The Genocide and Its Repercussion in Some Villages of Bhutan.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank to the Freie Universität Berlin, especially to Professor Shabo Talai and the Nana Foundation for this wonderful gathering and for the invitation, which I attend with huge pleasure. Do the people there behind, do you hear me well or good? So, as it has been told, I'm just taking out my papers, and in order to avoid any kind of inconveniences, because we are hastened because of the time, I think, Just a second, I'll start with, As you can realize, the Bhutan region is this one, okay? And then, if we go ahead, you see we are very next to Judida, or Serb, and so on. Exactly this is again. And what I'm going to tell about in a much more expanded way is this region. Exactly. We will start from Gazarta, Mansuria, we'll go back to Bashar, and we'll mention all these villages which are around, and we will arrive to those places which are not mentioned at all in many documentations, like Herbol, Bespin, and then Baznai, Halton, Ishi, Akhol, Hos, Mer, and we end up with Gesnach. This is the region I'm going to talk a little bit about. I haven't made a kind of, just a second, I'm going to the other side. I haven't made a study of all those villages. I've just chosen some of them because of the lack of time. So, many sources have been collected with reference to the Assyrian genocide, and we are still discovering the untold cruelty that was carried out by Turks and Kurds in northern Mesopotamia in general, and in the Bhutan region, as well as Diyarbakir, Mardin, Serd, Urfa, and Hakkari, and many, many other regions in particular. The Bhutan region is less known, and there are even some villages that are totally ignored and unfamiliar among the Assyrian people. This phenomenon is, in certain way, the fruit of the separation of the Assyrian people into different ecclesiastical branches. The Eastern Church, the Jacobite or Syrian Orthodox Church, the Chaldean Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, and so on. If the Assyrian people were not so divided, they would have a better chance surviving in this hostile environment. Such a statement should not be interpreted as a criticism, but rather as a fact based on the historical reality of so many centuries. If a people is divided, it becomes much more vulnerable and subject to misfortunes and disasters like the persecutions and the genocides that decimated the Assyrian people during the last 1,700 years. Due to the limited space of time in which to present this intervention, I will focus only on Gezerta and some other villages that were partially or totally destroyed during the Assyrian genocide, and the destruction of many other Assyrian villages that were emptied after that period, which took place from 1915 onward. In the following pages, I will try to highlight what the eyewitness testimonies have recorded on the systematic massacre of Gezarta of Zira and the villages around it. The testimonies I will relate to are the recordings that were made by Ishoya Bash from Ishi and others, the priest of Harbole, Kashelewis, Barchamis Okaratain, the report written by Bishop Israel Odo, and the small amount of information that has been given by Jacques Redoré and others. The authors of the Aramaic, Syriac, and French books focus their attention much more upon the city of Gezarta, but the records provide us with more details of what happened to different villages where no foreigner was able to visit nor to witness firsthand what happened to them. Bhutan. We have to go far back a little way in order to remember that this region did not suffer the genocide as it were its first massacre. The Bhutanese were defeated by the army of Bedr Khan Beg. Under the order of Bedr Khan Beg, the whole region was reduced to a slavery system from the beginning of the second half of the 19th century. Meanwhile, the Assyrian Ashirats in Tiari region enjoyed certain independence and autonomy. The region of Bhutan was totally subjugated, and its Assyrian inhabitants were forced to live under a feudal system that were, feudal system where each Kushan family or clan became ostensibly the property of a Kurdish tribe. Such a cruel reality was tangible especially in the villages, where each Kushan family was obliged to pay a particular protection tax per year. This slavery system endured until the different villages were abandoned and the villages fled to Western countries. What we have to keep in mind is the following fact. The region was obliterated even before 1915, which erased the few rest survived. I'm going to tell you about those villages that were partially or totally destroyed. I'm going to mention them, you will see them there. Well, in the Bhutan region, around 27 Assyrian villages suffered, as I mentioned, the effects of the genocide in different ways. Harboli, from where I come from, Bespen, Wasta, Talqabban, Taqiyan, Naurwan, Girge Bedro, Dadar, Hassan, Peshawar, Mansouriye, Deran Ktata, which means lower Deran and upper Deran, Allata, Jannat, Dargule, then Shah, Hertevin, and so on. The district of Shirnakh, Bejim, Billun, Marga, Uqwal, Ishi, Beznaye, Holton, Hos, Mer, Gaznakh, and so on. But let's go first to the Gazerta region, or to the city itself. As far as the second genocide period is concerned, the sources related to Gazerta, or Gzira, or Jizra in Turkish, report that our Assyrian brothers and sisters in this area were of different Kushan groups and rites. The city was inhabited by Syriacs, Chaldeans, and Jacobites, but the majority of its residents were Kurds who settled there after the massacres from previous different periods of conflict. As the main commerce and industry was in the hands of various Kushan Assyrian groups, the fanatical Muslims groups were always looking for a pretext in order to eliminate the rest of those diligent people that were usually treated with such scorn and rudeness. In the report of Jacques Rétoré, it relates a kind of this being diligent people of the Assyrian there, but I'm going to avoid it because we don't have so much time, and just I'm going to shorten. And I will go to the report of Israel Audo's one. According to the report of Israel Audo, who deals the topic in the chapter 7 of his memory, according to his report, in the middle of September 1915, the head of Mardin city sent his brother Silo to the heads of Gazarta, inquiring as to why they had still not started killing the Christians that were living among and around them. I'm quoting, "As we did and as our brothers have everywhere, you have to start immediately and without hesitation and being late. Now is the time of vengeance against our adversaries and the time of to exterminate the enemies of our religion and erase them from our region and land." Gazarta has become the Kurdish land in this sense. When the Muslim inhabitants of Gazarta heard these words from the mouths of the emissary, these are the direct words of Israel Audo, they woke up and came immediately to Kaimakam, who sent a message to all Kurdish heads to massacre by means of sword all Christian villages. Quote, "Do not leave anybody alive," was the order. The Christians came to know about the command, and many of them fled during the night to join Mosul. Those who fled to different villages in the Mosul district arrived in a grateful state, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. In this occasion, the bishop of the Jacobite community, Bihnam Aqraya, fled to Asnaqan, from there to the northern Iraq. The rest were liquidated in horrible ways. There were dead and naked bodies. Children were smashed against rocks. These are not my words, these are the words of Israel Audos. Others were killed in the arms of their mothers. Bishop Mar Yaqub Auraham of the Chaldean Church and Mar Mikhail Melki, who has been mentioned during these days, of the Syrian Catholic Church, within the priests of both churches, Hanna Marcus Elia of the Chaldean Church, Shimon Paulus of the Syrian Catholic Church, were all taken to prison and afterwards killed in a dreadful circumstances. Israel Audos report provides us with terrible details of how they murdered the clergy. First, both bishops were bound by their feet and were dragged around the city center like animal carcasses, and then they were driven next to the Tigris riverbank, where their naked bodies were abandoned and to become food for, all against are the words of the bishop, for dogs, jackals, and ravens. Afterwards, it was the turn of the priests, who suffered unimaginable atrocities before they gave up their last breath. The persecutors came back, took the priests and submitted them to horrible tortures and tortures, spitting on their face, snatching their beards, and kicking their belly as if they were beating an animal. They broke their bones and their heads were crushed. Afterwards, they were driven out and mocked in their nakedness as they were animals. As it's noted in the footnote, these horrific atrocities came to the ears of Israel Audo through what Abdallah Shlemon Paulus from Mosul heard when he was in Gazerta in 1917, through what the local residents told him. As usual, once they assassinated the clerics and the leaders of the community, it was then the turn of men and women, old and young, children and babies. The tactic was deliberate and calculated. First, the men were taken to prison in order to be ransomed with huge amount of money. Once there was no more money available, the detained people were taken out and killed as if they were animals. Their bodies were abandoned outside and became food for wild animals. These atrocities were undertaken at the beginning of September 1915. Once the males were disposed of, the criminals turned their hands on the females, carrying out unspeakable things on them before they were beheaded. The atrocities were reported by some females who fled from certain death and who were hidden for 2 years by some merciful Muslim from Mardin. At Gazarta, no one was left. The city was totally emptied, as well as many villages in the Botan region. And I'm going to tell something about my colleague Ephraim is going to talk about Mansouriya, but I'm going to give the short report that has been given by these authors. It has been recounted by the priest of Mansouriya, Father Augustine, that the mudir of the city called him saying, quote, "The Padishah has given the order to kill all the Christians. We will accomplish it starting with you." Without losing his serenity, the priest replied to Mudir, "May God protect our glorious Padishah. I hope you will allow me the mercy of going to my parishioners and talking with them. It may happen that in such danger we will be submitted to, that they could decide to become Muslims." Now the strategy. Go was the order. Go. The priest immediately gathered all his parishioners in the church and announced to them the decision that had been taken against them, at the same time exhorting them to continue to be faithful to Christ. And this, I'm quoting the words, "We will all die a day." He said to them, "But we do not know in which circumstances we will meet our death. If we die today for Christ, we will surely achieve eternal life. Let's abandon without sorrowfulness our goods and the life of this world, and thank God for having given us such an occasion to deserve His mercy." These are the words that are taken in the report of Jacques Rétoré, especially the document 235. all those parishioners were touched by the sentiments of the priest, and they prepared themselves to die. After that was why my question at the beginning, why they didn't have a resistance. Peshabur. Only. God's sake, I was going to. Well, the same thing happened to Peshabur. Peshabur village was inhabited by our Assyrian brothers and sisters of the Chaldean rite. It's said that more than 1,300 people were. 20 minutes really are over. That's bad. So in any case, more than 900 people from Peshabur were just suffered the genocide. The same thing happened then to Mar Yaqub's, which is not directly in the Botan region. You see here. The same Kurds, the Atashi Kurds, attacked the village with the aim of converting the Dominican residents into their own one. But the Wali of Mosul sent soldier troop in order to avoid that part. Let's go to the Mer and other villages. Mer, I'm going to tell about Herbole, Mer, and other villages, and ending up with anecdote. Mer was attacked also. They tried to find a kind of protection through their Kurdish protectors. They were protected by Derhinaya Kurds. Okay? As far as the Herbole case is concerned, they didn't find any protector. They tried to be protected by the Kurds of Gitai, which is quite next to the village, but they were ordered by the Shirnachai. The Kurds of Shirnach, if they were going to protect them, they were going to suffer the same consequences as the rest of the Christians. So the same thing happened to Hus. Several times was abandoned. It became a kind of, in 1915 wasn't so hard for them, but from 1924 onward, which has been mentioned, it was always a kind of attacking again, and then rebuilding or resettling the village, and again it was emptied. As far as Hassana is concerned, they suffered also the same consequences. They looked for protection, but at the end they didn't give them protection, and more than 25 people from Hassana, Upper and Lower Hassana, were victims of the genocide. I'm just summarizing. As far as the Ghaznah village is concerned, also the same thing happened. They were protected by their own ashirats, Kurdish ashirats, but it was a kind of a semi-protection. They were just like there is in German as freie Vogel, just free bird. Whoever wanted to do them what they wanted, they were just delivered to their mercy or to their destiny. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Hertevin anecdote, and I will end up. I have 2 minutes?
2 minutes, exactly.
Wonderful. In relation to the Christians from Hertevin, most of the residents of Hertevnaya were killed and by Kurdish groups led by Sheikh Sain, who destroyed the village. This persecution was undertaken in 1926. As well as the destruction, there were some horrible stories told by those murderers who participated actively in the genocide. The following short and horrible history, or story better said, is told by a certain Sabri, son of Teli, from Erhun, during his journey in Mersin, where many Hertevnai were fleeing from their village and settled there. He told them a bitter story that he heard from his own uncle, who was one of those who enjoyed killing Christians during the genocide, and was one of the many who enjoyed killing even small children. He was the one who told his nephew of this crime when he had the recordings we have been listening to. When yet many other Kurds were hunting humans as if they were hunting animals. What is incredibly hard to assimilate is the cruel manner by which they enjoyed hurting the defenseless children, like the case of a daughter-in-law of the local priest of the Assyrian village who was murdered together with her son. They let the woman who had her baby with her live. As usual, she was invited to be converted to Islam and so on. She refused. First, they tried to convince her in become as I say, Muslim and abandon her baby. But as she rejected, they then intimidated her with their guns, but she still refused to continue with her faith. And after several beatings, she was brutally killed. After they left, her baby of less than 7 months remained at her side for 2 weeks. Once their thirst of Christian blood was satisfied, they decided to return on their village. When they arrived at the place where they killed this woman, they realized that her baby was incorrupt and her baby was nourishing himself from his mother's breast. The man, not receiving enough satisfaction from killing the child's mother, took the baby and threw him in the water canal that was transporting water to the water mill. On arriving to the mill, they enjoyed seeing a baby, less than 1 year old, fighting for his life, and he refused to drown. One of them said, "This infidel, this gaur, will not die without my stick," and they just killed him, beating him. And I'm finishing just a second anecdote. Similar atrocities have been spoken by Kuvi.
We do not have for another anecdote, I'm sorry.
Well, the same thing, 2 kids were killed in horrible ways. They just bound their hands and feet, they put them very next to an anthill, and the ant were the one on that summer side, they were totally destroyed. I'm very sorry to end up with this anecdote, but this is the trueness and which we have to denounce. Why not? And we have to learn from it, not to commit the same mistake and error. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So our second presentation is by Benjamin Trigonaharani, who is an independent scholar from Canada. And the title of his presentation is A History of Adıyaman, Seyfo in a Syro-Ottoman Text.
Interest has been in the period just before World War I. In particular, I had an interest in the emergence of an intellectual movement amongst the Ottoman Süryani. And I use the word Süryani here to refer to, or in the way that the Ottomans used it, and that would be to refer to the Syriac Orthodox, the Syriac Catholics, and of course Protestant converts as well. So in particular, I studied the journalism of some of these great figures that a lot of us know, Naum Faik, Ashur Yusuf. And one of the things that has characterized their writings is that they use Ottoman Turkish, and particularly they use Ottoman Turkish written in the Syriac alphabet. Which brings me to the topic of my presentation today, which is a document written in Syro-Ottoman that details life in an Ottoman town, Adıyaman, before, during, and after Seyfo. So this document is a couple of things to me. I mean, it's a remarkable example of the Syro-Ottoman language, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's also one of the only documents I think we have on the fate of the Süryani from Adıyaman. So I'd like to speak about the importance of this document, but we should be careful. Seyfo is not the central topic of this. This is more of an autobiography that one man has written, but it is still a central part in the sense that it influences the direction of one person's life. A second note is that this is very much a local history. I don't want to imply that anything that is described about Adıyaman in this document is necessarily to be taken as a template for understanding how Seyfo occurred in any other location. The only other time that I've ever really done research on Seyfo was for Diyarbakır. And I really believe that there's some sort of fundamental differences between how Seyfo occurred in Adıyaman and Diyarbakır. So this, and I don't know how necessarily you're going to see this document as representative of how we understand Seyfo in other areas. But what I want to do is at least present this document to the real genocide scholars yourselves and add it to this corpus of primary sources that we have for understanding what happened. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the geography of Adıyaman, because I know we've had a lot of maps already, but no one has actually put up a map that I think has Adıyaman on it. So first of all, Adıyaman is located in the province of Mamleket-ül-Aziz. It's in sort of the southern part of it, and it's primarily attached to the Sanjak of Malatya. Zoom in a little bit here. So you can see that Adıyaman, and sorry, I should say that Adıyaman is the modern name, and in fact, during Ottoman times, it was known as Husn-ı Mansur. So you can see Husn-ı Mansur is sort of like the southwest part of this area that I've highlighted in the red box. And this Adıyaman region is bordered on the south and the east by the Euphrates River. And really, Adıyaman is more than just a single sub-district of Malatya province. It actually kind of encompasses like this larger region, a couple of other Ottoman districts. So we have Kyata and also Shiro, which doesn't show up on this map. So Kyata and Husn-ı Mansur are both part of Malatya Sanjak. And then Shiro, which is a little bit further to the north, is actually part of Mamleket-ül-Aziz Sanjak as well. And I think I've got a little picture of the administrative structure, just so you know. It's all part of Mamleket-ül-Aziz Vilayet, but then there's two different Sanjaks at play here, but primarily Malatya. And also, to go back, just to situate the region in relationship to some other important areas, we can see that Urfa is to the south, Malatya up to the north, and then Diyarbakir is sort of due east of there. Literate Suryani of this period would have been familiar with some of the smaller villages, even in this region. From the subscription records that we have from the newspapers published in Diyarbakir and Harput, we know that villagers were subscribers to these newspapers, and they would actually write letters in to people like Naum Faik or Ashur Yusuf. So we actually have a little bit of information about life in some of these smaller areas. So some of the important villages that we might know are Gerger, Venk, Keferdiz, and Avan. There's also a religious importance to this region. The Euphrates River Valley had at least 4 monasteries, ancient monasteries, so Mor Barsalmo, which is well known, Mor Adai, Mor Abhai, and also Mor Dimet. And I have a little map here. This is a hand-drawn map, obviously, of the Adıyaman region, and it has the names of the villages, which are important for the Syriac population. And also, to like the left of this image, we have the names of the monasteries, which sort of flank the Euphrates River around Gerger, especially. And this map's a little bit hard to understand spatially because the north is at the bottom and the south is at the top. So I rotated it and then labeled some of the locations that might be familiar to us. So Adıyaman, Malatya, Urfa, for example. And you can see the Euphrates River in black here is running, as we would expect from the south up to the north and kind of framing this whole Adıyaman region in general. So what else do we, and one other thing I'd mention you, Shiro does not appear on this map. It's a little bit further to the north. But at this time, even just before World War I, there was actually an emigre community of Shirolu Suryani in the United States. And they'd started to form an organization which was named after Mor Barsalmo, the closest monastery to their village. So what else do we know about the Adıyaman region? The Suryani were very much in the minority here. I've looked at the Ottoman census records, and obviously these records shouldn't necessarily be taken at face value, but just to give us some context, the Ottoman 1914 census for the Kaza of Husn-ı Mansur gave only 400 Suryani living there. In comparison, there was about 3,500 Armenians. So from that, we can surmise, maybe these numbers aren't correct, but there was probably approximately like a tenth of the Christian population would have been Suryani at that time. Nevertheless, I really feel that there was some reason for optimism amongst the Adıyaman Suryani just before World War I. So we have some interesting examples. First of all, I already mentioned that this opening of the press, and we actually find these villagers subscribing to the newspapers, which is pretty interesting. We also have reports that the Archbishop in Harput, Abdul Nur, was responsible for intervening to protect these monasteries because Armenians were trying to take over the monasteries, and there was some low-level conflict between between the religious clergy on both sides there. There was also the Ottoman troops had been assigned to protect Suryani pilgrims on their yearly visits to these monasteries as well. We also have the records in the archives that show an application for the Suryani in Adıyaman, in Hısn Mansur itself, to have their churches repaired and a new church constructed. And in the Ottoman archives, for example, I found this drawing as part of the application for the church in Adıyaman. And it also included the floor plan that gives you like the dimensions. And if you go into the archives, you can see like a list of people who donated money for this construction. So there's this apparent sort of positive reason for the Adıyaman Suryani just before 1914. I mean, not everything was perfect. I've already mentioned there's this sort of low-level conflict with Kurds and Armenians at the time. There was also the fact that, you know, frankly, the community was still recovering from the 1895 massacres, which had really affected them. And also there was some internal discord in the community. There was some conflicts between the religious establishment and some of the villagers over some of their actions. So with this context, with this Adıyaman context, let me bring you to the document itself. And I've got some slides of just the first few pages as it was given to me. So the document is actually written in just a school notebook. So this is the first image in the set that I received. On the first page, and again, this is in Ottoman Turkish, it's a list of the villages and where they're located. We have a first draft of that map that I showed you earlier, which was never completed. And then the title page, okay? And at the top it says Adıyaman Tarihi. And then the second line there is, let me just read that for you, is Makdisi Barsum ve evlatlarının yeri göbeğe kadar olan tarihi. Further down we have the name of the author, which is Bolus Munafer, and the date that it was written, which is 1961. And then continuing on, here's the first page of the actual document itself. And this part is more of a geographic summary and sort of a light local history. So what do we know about the author, Bolus Munafer? Well, we know he was born in 1900 in Adıyaman. Unfortunately, there's 2 pages missing from the document that I received, and those give the background of the Munafer family. So I'm kind of missing some of the context here, but from what I gather, they immigrated from Gergerd at some point to Adıyaman itself. The language that's used here is really unique. It's unlike this sort of high Ottoman that we got in the works of Naum Faik and Ashur Yusuf. It's more of a colloquial Adıyaman dialect that's used. There's lots of spelling mistakes according to standard Ottoman Turkish rules. There's a lot of localisms, you know, vocabulary that you wouldn't find outside of Adıyaman normally. It was written in 1961, which is pretty amazing. I doubt that there's many, if any, Ottoman Turkish books that were written at this late of a date. And in fact, at the very end, there's a small addition, and this part was written, you can see here, it's written in Beirut. It's written on the 15th of November, 1968 even. So this is the very last bit that was added onto it. So the majority of the work was not written in Beirut, but actually in Kamishli, where the Munafer family lived. So with that sort of background on the work, I'm just going to dive right into the actual Seyfo section, because I'm sure I'm going to run out of time if I don't. So as I said, Seyfo is not the central part of this work, but there's some really important things for us to, I think, that we can learn from it. The first sort of indication that something was going to happen in Bolus Munafer's eyes, and I'm going to relate this back to what Professor Aydın brought up yesterday, was that there was a banner or a poster hung in the central square of Adıyaman that said, in Turkish, it said, Ey sevgili vatandaşlarım, içimizden bu mikrobu temizleyelim. So let's clean out this, this microbe inside of us. And this was the first warning that the Christians in Adıyaman had that something was going to be done to them. And that was 7 months after the start of World War I, or the declaration of the Ottoman Empire to enter the war. And a month after that poster was hung up, we get the first reports of arrests, searches, a few executions of people who were found with weapons. At this point, Bolus is very clear, though. This was directed entirely at Armenians. He says that no Ottoman troops at this point entered the Suryani neighborhoods or said anything to them. But of course, this did change ultimately. And what we get is as with other places, we get prisoners released from jail and provided with uniforms of the gendarmerie. And it's these people who ultimately will perpetrate some of the worst acts of violence against the Suryani. He does describe some of the suffering of Armenians sort of in addition here. So it's typical stuff that we've probably grown accustomed to hearing, where there's deportations or killings on the roads by Kurds. So the one event that I'm going to try and focus on here is, this is in the summer of 1915, and there's a plague of locusts that arrives in Adıyaman, and people are conscripted. It's not really clear. I know Suryani and Adıyaman were conscripted to do this, possibly also Muslims. It's not really clear. And they're taken out to the fields and instructed to try and kill as many locusts as possible. And during this, the authorities pick out, it's not really clear why, they pick out certain Suryani and they pick out certain Armenians, and they just throw them in jail. And in August of 1915, something happens, and a number of these people who are in jail are taken out to a place called Çatalkaya. And I don't really know where this is. My understanding is it's somewhere on the outskirts of Adıyaman. And they're massacred. The numbers are not huge, in the sense that there's only 18 Suryani who are killed. But there's something important here. There's 50 Armenians approximately and 18 Suryani who are murdered at Çatalkaya. But there's a couple of things that I think are important to emphasize. So as a non-genocide researcher, I've often wondered how often the Suryani were sort of incidental victims. They were maybe mistaken for Armenians or not really considered as something different. But what happens at Çatalkaya kind of changed my mind about that, in this instance at least. And that is because one person is responsible for all of the killing of Suryani. Other people kill the Armenians, but there's one guy, his name is Abu Pasha, and he was one of the convicts who was released from jail. And he seems to have something out for the Suryani, and he's the one who takes 18 lives at Çatalkaya. So I think that's kind of like an important point to emphasize here, in that there was some sort of intentional targeting of Suryani in this event. So moving on from the Çatalkaya massacre, just to a couple other points. In 1916, this same Abu Pasha resurfaces. He murders a Muslim, actually, and his intention here is to blame the murder on 2 Suryani priests, one Orthodox and one Catholic. Now, his plan fails. It doesn't happen. He's caught effectively, but he goes unpunished by the authorities. And in 1916, we also see the ransacking of that church, which I showed you earlier from the Ottoman archives. It's basically everything is stolen. Anything of value. And again, the authorities don't take any action against the perpetrators. The implication here is they know who did it, but nothing is done about it. One of the really remarkable parts of this document, though, I think, is that Bolus Monafer goes through and he lists all the Adıyaman families and basically the fates of each one of them. So I'm just going to skip to a summary of, these are just excerpts from this list. It's much, much longer, and he writes in this really short point form about what happens to the different people from these different families. So if you look through, you can see, someone's killed by Kurds, someone's killed by Turks, someone's killed at Çatalkaya. Some people escape, some people, they move away or they die from, benign causes like falling out of a tree. So this is one page of these, and I'm skipping quickly here. Here's some more just examples that I took out here. So I think this is a really valuable resource for us coming along and just understanding what exactly happened to all these people who used to live in Adıyaman. I've sort of taken a summary of all of these different points and consolidated them to some simple notes. So he listed 66 different families from Adıyaman, the town of Adıyaman. I found that there's 40 families were affected by some way by a killing during Seyfo. It could be by Kurds, it could be by Turks or something else. There are some other people who were killed. I think there was one person who was killed in Damascus, but it wasn't really clear to me that was connected at all with Seyfo, so I didn't count it in here. We have the names, or at least the identities of all 18 people who were killed at Çatalkaya. Notably, and I think this is important in acknowledging, about half of the families at least partially stayed in Adıyaman after Seyfo. So it was not a complete extermination by any means of the population there. But you can see that a large number of them basically end up being dispersed throughout the world, basically. I mean, a large number in Syria, in different places, other parts of the Middle East, and beyond, whether it's Armenia or all the way into the United States and Argentina and et cetera. Now, one thing also that's important to remember is that Bulus, of course, survives the war. He actually acknowledges that he fared not too badly. He was a tailor. The skilled Armenians were all gone, and he made a reasonable living throughout the war. He had some hardships. At one point, his sewing machine presumably, was confiscated by the authorities for no reason. So he had to suffer through some difficulties. But ultimately, he came through the war okay. And in fact, after the hostilities ceased, he actually implies that things actually started to look fairly decent for the Suryani of Adıyaman. He describes his trips that he takes to Malatya just for the sheer pleasure of it in this period right after 1918, between 1918 and 1920, basically. He's involved with the opening of a new Suryani school even in Adıyaman during this period. But what he describes in 1920 is he says that basically the Turkish oppression started again. And this is, of course, connected with the new government that comes into, that starts to come into power, starts to take shape inside the Ottoman Empire or Turkey at this time. And he relates some incidents that he's involved with altercations with Muslims in the town. And eventually a friend he has, a Turkish friend he has, who works in the police, advises him, basically says, you have to get out. It's not going to be safe for you anymore. So in 1921, okay, he's 21 years old, he just got married, and he and 4 friends hire some Kurdish smugglers to take them to Aleppo. And basically, this is the end of the Seyfo part of this book. I mean, from here on through to the end of the work, he describes his life in Syria, where he founds a new life for himself, along with other Suryani who've also been displaced by the events of Seyfo. So I'm going to sort of just wrap this up with some concluding comments. It's not really clear from this work about what the complicity of the Ottoman government is in what happens in Adıyaman. I think that we can safely say it's a little bit ambiguous, and possibly it was changing different times. So, for example, after the Çatalkaya massacre, when all these Christians were killed, the government's response is actually to release the remaining Suryani from prison for whatever reason. They're given a pardon and they're let out. So there seems to be this sort of fluctuation in the government's approach towards the Suryani, not the Armenians. The Armenians are a little bit more clear-cut. But the other thing that's important to notice is that, post-war, we get this period where there seems to be some action by the government to take, to recognize the fact that the Suryani have been affected by what happened up to 1918, let's say. And in fact, there's an Ottoman document that we have where the government acknowledges that Suryani have been killed, their properties have been plundered, and the government says that the authorities in Hısn Mansur, in Shiro, in Kyata have to take action against the perpetrators of this. This is 1919, and clearly in 1920, that's not happening, and we get this reversal, this homogenization efforts by the Turkish government starts up again. So that, I think, is as much time as I have. Fatma, yes? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. Actually, in 1920, there were 2 governments in the Ottoman Empire, one in Ankara and the other one in Istanbul. And I think what's very important is that once the independence movement started, they confiscated the telegraph communication. So as a consequence, it could be that during that period, until the Kemalists established their own communication and authority, there was ambiguity of authority, and as a consequence, probably the local authorities did what they personally thought was fitting, and that may explain some of that, but I just thought about that. I'm therefore abusing my privilege as the chair here. Sorry, we're moving on to the next presenter, Ablahad Lahto from Uppsala University, and the presentation is called The Struggle of Einward, Elements of Success and Treachery. Actually, the title of my presentation is changed. The title you just mentioned was my working title, and my title now is Ayuardo, A Struggle for Existence. Some of us saw the movie yesterday, the documentary of Aziz Saeed, and we heard also today Dr. Donev mentioning Ayuardo, and now I feel that I have maybe not so much new to add,
but nevertheless, I will try to read my paper anyhow, hoping that will add some kind of information. The areas mentioned, or the areas in red here, over the cities and villages in Trabdin are the one I'm mentioning in my paper. So, Aywardo, or Inward, Ainwardo, Ainvert, and Turkish Gölgeze, is a village in Trabdin, and it is built on a hill, some 2 hours walk from Midyat. When approaching Aywardo, for example, from Midyat, one crosses a long and broad valley at the end of which a fortress-like construction appears. The colossal building of the church of Morhushabo stands on the top of, on the peak of this hill, and it is surrounded by strong walls and defensible towers. At the time of the massacres of 1915, 200 Syriac Orthodox families lived in this village and no Muslims. By summer the same year, between 6,000 and 7,000 Syriac Christians from the nearby villages and from Midyat took their refuge in this village. Many of these refugees came from Midyat. They could escape through secret underground tunnels that were also mentioned today. And they searched for refuge in this village. Once safely in Aywardo, the refugees reported all the horrifying deeds that their close ones had been put through and the destiny that their villages had met. This kind of permanent state of insecurity revolved around Christian villages. Between the massacres of 1895 and the terrible years of 1915 to 1917, the Syriacs of Trabdin were particularly exposed to violence. By giving the Kurdish chieftains carte blanche, the Sublime Porte had for the last few years been pursuing its goals gradually, pursuing its goal of gradually annihilating the Christian element. While the massacres of 1895 were still fresh memories for many in Trabdin, the devastations of the so-called Hamidiyya al-Aylara, that is Abdul Hamid II's own border cavalry, spread even more terror in the region. De Courtois cites from Diplomatic Dispatch 2, number 2, an incident of Friday, December the 20th, 1901, where Colonel Mustafa Pasha himself, at the command of a detachment of Kurdish horsemen, attacked the village of Babeka, 1 hour from Azakh. 5 men were killed and 7 were wounded, and all flocks of the village were stolen. When the people of Azakh decided to come to Babeka's rescue, they fell into a trap and lost 11 men with 7 wounded. The news of this attack reached Jizre, and fear spread throughout the Christian region that a new wave of massacres will break out again. In addition, rumors of preparations for a general massacre of Christians had circulated for some time before Faizi Bey, the National Assembly deputy, arrived in Jizre on April 15, 1915. Rashid Bey had sent him to coordinate the Kurdish tribes. 10 days after he left Jizre, Kurdish tribes and Turkish military could be observed surrounding the Syriac villages of Garissa and Kovac. In the international arena, Bosnia was annexed to Austria, and the Ottomans lost much territory in Europe through the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Large waves of Muslim refugees streamed into Istanbul and Western Anatolia. The refugees needed land and place to live, so the Ottoman authorities developed a scheme of demographic engineering that would also enable Turkification of those refugees who were not yet Turkish speaking. The refugees would be resettled in Eastern Anatolia on land confiscated from people suspected of disloyalty. Thus, orders came to move populations. So, in the light of the above mentioned, and listening to the refugees' eyewitness stories in Aywardo, which made it clear that not only Armenians were the subject of the genocide, but Christians in general, Masoud Mzizakhi, a local leader in Aywardo, started preparations to defend the village. He assembled in relatively short time 700 fighters from all the men that now were sheltered in the village. At night, they would dress in black and carry out rescue operations to rescue people who survived exclusion squads or escaped from deportation convoys. After conquering Midyat, the Kurds, Turks, and Mhalami prepared to attack both Iwardo and Anhel, where there were also many Christian refugees. Media's Kurdish leader, Aziz K. Mahmadou, suggested that all join forces to strike against Iwardo as a first priority. One of the reasons for Mahmadou's recommendation may have been based on the news about the rescue squads of Iwardo. Hence, the mass aggressors concentrated on Iwardo. And on an unspecified Friday, in the middle of July 1915, a force up to 13,000 men besieged Iwardo. This force was collected by Turkish officials from the Kurdish tribes, from the Midyat and Medin areas, and some of the Mhalami, as well as the Rama tribe further to the north. The force was equipped with weapons, ammunition, and food supplies from the government's warehouses. And bitter battles began immediately with casualties on both sides. Now to the preparations. When it became clear for the Syriacs of Iwardo that they would also be slaughtered, Mas'ud began preparations and set up a strategic plan for the defense. The major elements in his preparations were strengthening the village's defense, storing food supplies, and procuring weapons and ammunition. Mas'ud's grandson, Sabri, relates in an interview that his grandfather left to Iwardo, refurbished its surrounding, repaired, and reinforced the walls. Mas'ud sent even a note to the shepherds of Mzizah, asking them to come to Iwardo on a specific day and bring along all the livestock that is in the whole village. Furthermore, the Syriacs had harvested and prepared their crops before the arrival of the aggressors. Some of the people of Midyat even brought their crops and stored it in Iwardo. During the time of preparation, Mas'ud is said to have contacted the Syriac leaders of Midyat in order to collect money to buy weapons. It is unclear how much help he received there, but leaving the meeting, Mas'ud was approached by a child who told him that he lived close to the military barracks and knew where they stored the munitions. During the siege, Mas'ud is said to have sent 40 men together with this child at 3 o'clock in the morning and brought the munitions to Iwardo. De Courtois writes that the inhabitants of Tur Abdin were used to living in difficult conditions and to fighting against the Kurds, and thus developed a fierce character and a tenacity of resisting. Father Armare states further that on Monday, the 21st of June, soldiers started to circulate the Christians' houses searching for weapons. So, these assertions indicate that the Syriacs already had weapons, most probably flintlock rifles, and ammunition to defend themselves. And from oral testimony, we also learn that they were able to manufacture gunpowder and bullets. Gunpowder, for example, was produced from a mixture of dog excrement together with growth from cave walls, and bullets were manufactured from copper or lead, as we heard earlier today. In this matter, Armale states that there was no copper or lead left in the village, that they did not melt, formed, and used against the enemy. Also, the enemy bullets that hit the walls and fall down were collected, melt, formed, reused against the enemy. Now, if we assume that the villagers of Iwardo prepared themselves in any way they could, that is, restore the walls, stored food supplies, prepare their weapons, and manufactured gunpowder and bullets, it is still inconceivable that 700 men could resist up to 13,000 fighters of both regular army and paramilitary troops for nearly 2 months. In warfare, there is a principle that is called 3-to-1, which means in order to conquer a city and move forward, the aggressors ought to be 3 times stronger than defenders. But in this particular case, the defenders were just a decimal of the attacking force. What were thus the elements that enabled them to resist for that long? The military thinker Karl von Clausewitz is widely acknowledged as the most important of the classical strategic thinkers. Even though he has been dead for nearly 2 centuries, he remains a powerful living influence. and in many respects, the most modern of strategic theories. In his book, Principles of War from 1812, which is still one of the most applied theories in officers' training, Clausewitz writes about general principles for defense. Now, whether Masoud Mzizakhi was familiar with these theories or not is hard to determine. What is clear, on the other hand, is that the major part of Masoud's plan for the defense fits well into Clausewitz's theories. Below, I will try to account for some of these principles that may have been essential for the defense. 1. Clausewitz writes, we must at every instant be on the defensive, and thus should place our forces under as much cover as possible. If we have troops in reserve, they can attack the enemy which is seeking to envelop us. This is done advantageously in a terrain chosen in advance, where we have arranged things to our advantage. During the preparations, Masoud restored the walls and reinforced them to secure the cover needed for the siege. The so-called Korzakat, we saw them yesterday in Aziz Said's movie, documentary, that is, the revetments, were manned by well-covered men determined to die rather than surrender. When opportunity was given, Masoud sent out these men who were not directly involved in the defense to stage counterattacks in order to split the enemy and create confusion among them. Some of these attacks were especially successful because these men knew the terrain well, and most probably also because they used the secret underground tunnels. During one of these attacks, the defenders managed even to seize the battle flag of the enemy. Success of this kind must have raised combat morale immeasurably. It is probable that they also tried to seize as many weapons and food supplies as possible during these counterattacks. So war trophies as these were also essential for the battle. And Napoleon used to say that factors of combat morale weighs 3 times more than any other factors in combat. 2. Clausewitz was convinced that effective command performance in war is the product of genius, where genius is defined as the capability of the commander-in-chief that consists of a combination of rational intelligence and sub-rational intellectual and emotional abilities that make up intuition. It is obvious that Masoud had the qualities of a leader. Armale describes him as the brave leader of Iwardo that gathered the men and the young men and infused in them the spirit of enthusiasm and proudness. He made them rise and defend themselves against the Turks till the last breath. Rizko Bashe tells in an interview about how this leader could use emotional appeal to encourage the villagers. He says, when the Kurds attacked, they reached the church of Morhushabu. So Masoud, may God have mercy on his soul, he said, woe has come, you people of Midyat. Woe has come, you people of Mzizah. Woe has come, you people of Iwardo. Heaven has come to our door. Rise and fight. Let the women shout out loud their joyfulness, and let the men fight. Sabri declares further that Masoud used to spread disinformation to the enemy. It is told that Masoud said to the women in Iwardo, go up and pretend to crush Birghal. Sing the Hammawhaye. So the enemy thinks that we still have Birghal. So the women pretended to crush it with the crushers like this, boom, 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 on the rooftops of the village, and sang the Hammawhaye. The Turks asked the Kurds, what are they doing? The Kurds answered, they are preparing fresh Birghal, meaning that they still have lots of food supplies. 3. According to Clausewitz, the element of surprise plays a great role in tactics. In our case here, Midyat had been attacked, refugees were streaming into Iwardo seeking shelter, and hence the attack of Iwardo was expected when the villages were not taken by surprise when the aggressors marched towards the village. The aspects mentioned above were some general principles of defense that fits well in these theories, but there are other factors I'm going to mention now that may also have played an important role for the defense. For example, one, tactical background. In general, the defenders were villagers. Nonetheless, some of them had served 7 years or more in the Turkish army and thus gained experience. During one of these assaults against the village, they killed 50 Turks, including one high-ranking officer, possibly concentrating their fire on him in the knowledge that this would result in confusion and shock among the aggressors. These men were able also to interpret enemy signals, that is the bugle, which made it easy to understand the enemy's intended moves. Moreover, the aggressors seemed to have not gathered any kind of intelligence before the siege, and hence were stunned by the defenders' ability. 2. Motivation. For a long time, the Christians had been living under hard conditions. They were often terrorized by Kurds who wanted to confiscate their villages and lands. With the massacres of 1895 in fresh memory, and with the Kurdish horsemen Hamidiyya al-Aylera that were terrorizing Christians in the region, and finally the fall of Midyat, there was no doubt what needed to be done. These were now facts that motivated the villagers and made them determined to rather fight and die in battle than surrender and be slaughtered. Further, the bishop Morphilixinos Ablahad preached in the church of Morhushabo, telling his congregation that it was their sacred duty to resist even though they were outnumbered. Three, strategic location. As I mentioned, Iwado is built on a hill. From the top of the church of Morhushabo, it was easy to observe the surrounding terrain. So any kind of enemy moves were easily observed and measures against such moves were taken. Now to the aftermath. The effect of this defense was that Iwado was never conquered. Nevertheless, after 52 days of fighting, the whole village was exhausted. Many women and children had starved to death. Their bodies were stretched on the ground and stank and infected the combatants. Food supplies were running low, and the villagers had already been forced to slaughter the better part of their cattle. At the same time, and while the aggressors seemed not being able to conquer the village, they sent messages that the defenders of the Christian village of Anhel converted to Islam and thus reserved amnesty. Hence, the defenders found themselves forced to negotiate for a ceasefire. According to oral testimony from Yusuf, the aggressors at first asked for 500 rifles in order to leave the siege. But at last, the two parties agreed upon the number of 300 rifles, and thus the siege was lifted. Despite the guarantees of amnesty, most of the Syriacs remained in their villages and did not dare to return to their original villages. This may be due to the stories the villagers heard from the Armenian and the Syriac refugees of how the Kurdish tribes and the government forces tricked them. First, they would ask to hand over their weapons, and then they would be saved. But after complying, they were massacred. Thus, the Christians stayed in the village, not daring to leave because the ambushes from the warriors of the neighboring villages. Indeed, those who dared to go back to their villages were killed. Armale states that the number of those who died during the siege was greater than those who died during the siege. Hanna Savaro states further that after the siege was lifted, 19 men left Iwado to bring firewood after this long siege. All of them were killed in one single day, as soon as they left the village because of an ambush. This same story was confirmed also by Yusuf. Concerning Mas'ud, after the siege was lifted, he traveled between the Christian villages and advised them to struggle and fight their enemy. In January 1918, the Dalinas and the Hajj tribes tracked him and killed him. Thank you for your attention.
They took it with them, and this is my kidnapped bishop, Mor Gregorios, and always we had a lot of work should be done, how to revive our identity, and especially how to republish the manuscripts. And in manuscripts, this is also my work with cataloging we could find also many material with the colopons. And the last thing that yesterday I was honored that Professor Otto Yastro was here, and this is actually the survival of Mlahso, and he is the son that Professor Otto that has interviewed, and I was working also helping him with editing this book and publishing it in Arabic. And yesterday I just knew that my dear colleague, Dr. John Yusuf, actually that he did a professional academic translation, and I really hope that it will be appear for publication. Okay, so I would start now my presentation that this is my grandfather, and this ring always linked with our family that came from Mansouriya, and we had a lot of oral narratives that I have to hear from many people of my family. And I visited Mansouriya personally in 2005, 2010, and I'm going to talk here, and thanks to Dr. Aydin that yesterday he talked about the psychological trauma that now after 100 years, now I'm talking as like the third generation of these genocides, and I can transmit to you about my feelings, about my reflection after 100 years. And before I start, I would like to thank Afrem because he already alluded to Mansouriya, and I hope I can add some other important information. First of all, I don't know what really happened in Mansouriya. So here that we have some narrative stories that said here and there, and but what I did the studies with the oral, and then later with the description with Armale, with Karabashi, Mozliho, and the most important thing is actually a manuscript written by Dolabani, Bishop Dolabani, and it's not well known academically, so that's I'm focusing on here. And there was a tribe called the Dashiya that actually, and ironically, it's more or less very close to Daesh today. So Dashiya, Daesh, and this actually really make it problematic for me as a trauma. And I'm not sure if we can call, I'm not sure if we can call the case of Mansouriya was a genocide. I leave this open to the genocide scholars, if we can call it massacre, genocide. But for me, at least there was murdering, there was killing, and for people just because they were peaceful, they were Christians, but I'm not sure if they were killed because of their ethnicity. I leave that open to your discussion, dear scholars and professors of genocide issue. There is another phenomena, and I think that there were some people who were arguing, was there resistance or not? At least in the case of Mansouriya, there was no resistance. So the people were very peaceful, and this is what pissed me off. That's what pissed me off, because they were so peaceful, and always we had to ask a question. These peaceful people, why they didn't protect themselves like the people in Ainward on the other? But maybe, like we had in the last discussion here, the geography was not helpful enough, and that's why they had nothing to choose. I would start and sharing with you some of my family archive stuff, history, and some of my manuscript research stuff about the Mansouriya village case. Sitting with my family that we are, as I said, from Mansouriya, and they live now in Lübeck, close to Hamburg, remembering all the memories of my old aunt who was in the age of 80s, and she had to visit our house in Aleppo. My aunt Husne, she remembered well that how actually the Muslims, they announced jihad in the village, and the Christians gathered inside the church of Saint Issia, of Mar Issia. The Muslims knocked the door, asking the Christians to open the doors and comforting them that definitely we're not going to kill you, we're neighbors. And then they trusted them, and actually they came, they killed them. She used to tell us about, she used to tell us there was one young man, he was so beautiful, and they gave him the choice that you can convert to Islam, we like you. And then he said, life with Jesus is much better than this eternal life. And then they killed him. So this is actually what was the oral. And strikingly, actually, so this is the family tree, and here we see that actually that the family that they say that how about we have these two members that they were killed in the genocide. So we were kids, and always we had to know about this stuff. But my father, that when the family moved to Darbasi, this is my father, and he was involved with politics, with the social life, he had never say anything. So he had always to keep it covered up out only from my aunts and some stories from old people. They had to talk about it. And always that was also eating me why you don't talk about it. But he had another theory that maybe adaptation. He had excellent connections with the Kurdish parties in Jazeera area in North Syria. He was a politician for a few years, and that's why that maybe he didn't want to talk about it. So I started, when I grew up, I started to collect as much as possible pieces of evidence, and I always would like to talk about this eyewitnessing. So I started recording since 2005 some old people that they were still alive at that time. The first one was Abdel Masih Najmeh. He passed away in 2014. So I hope that this would work, the video. If not, then we can move on. So, no problem. Okay, I think that let's go back, and now here. So the sound system doesn't work, not a problem, kind problem. Anyway, so he was talking here, by the way, this is the photo from the church of Mar'isya in Mansouri, and I took this photo. And then later they converted the mosque. That was actually the oral tradition, that Mar'isya in Syriac, which means Hakim, which means doctor. And then when they converted it to a mosque, they call it Muhammad al-Hakim. So that's something interesting, that at least that they try to keep the function of this holy place. And then the second one actually is Deacon Shafiq. And so the first one was an eyewitness. He used to talk that what he picked up from information from his parents, and he was born in 1914, the same like this person, Deacon Shafiq. And he used to tell me, so when I was in Aleppo, we had to sit almost every day in the evening prayer, and I had to record all this stuff. So anyone that who is interested to collect this eyewitnessing recording, I have many of them. And he used to tell me here that he used to talk about when they started. Let me try the last time. Yes.
تقريبا المغرب جارينا حاجه هندي بعد واحد يشوف رحت اقرب عليهم قالوا عم بحضرني انتو قالوا والله انتو يا نعم راحت لبيت جعفران وقال لك قلبت الكاد كلها على بيت جعفران 1926 اقول 26 كانت 21 اظن 21.
So anyway, I'm not going here. Here he is talking that actually that even after the 1915, there were also a lot of stuff, especially around Za'afaran monastery, and always they talk about Kurds. So the Kurdish tribes, they are surrounding Za'afaran, and how his father was a hero actually, and then he could go inside the monastery and he could save his wife. But then later his father actually was killed because he was self-confident. He went to the villages, and then actually that the soldiers, they killed him, and according to this Shafiq, that they betrayed him, so that they were not hero even when they killed him. And then I have some other oral traditions like these proverbs that you were reading, that onion is onion regardless red or white. So all Christians, they have to be killed. And then Muslim blacksmith throwing iron, and then he say you have to bear this because you better bear it than you bear it in the hell. And then also sharing the food. So we have all this stuff, and I think that they are worth studying seriously or paying attention, because maybe after a few years, definitely that we will miss all these kind of first generation or more or less eyewitness. So I would really encourage for those people that if we still have eyewitnesses, that they can do something. And thanks to the people yesterday that they did the movie, that I think this is important that to search about this stuff. And always my question was, all this stuff is so the so-called genocide, Seyfo, Safar Ballik, Sawqiyat, so is this legend or authentic? And when I start to work with the colophons of the manuscripts, I could find some stuff. And for example, this Armali, that he copied it for the Montserrat monastery, and Patriarch Abdel Masih, when he talked also about the biographies of the patriarchs, and this is Za'afaran 107. I'll talk about it later. But this is the colophon actually from Armali, and he is talking here actually that how about the Turkish, that they did something very charitable that which should be like the genocide. So So Abad Turkoy, Trune, Wadlo Rahmi. So we can really find, so anyone who is also interested that maybe we can also work collecting colophons that they were copied in this time, and definitely would find a lot of stuff. Geographically, the Mansouriya is not far from Mardin. It's 3 kilometers, and that was interesting at some time because the 3 kilometers is not really difficult to protect. So it's, as you can see here on Google, walking is something like 48, and I think 3 kilometers less than that you can walk. And always we have this problem. So with the confusion of the mythology, mixing up with a lot of stories and the genocides, and maybe I thought that people they try to fabricate a story after that, but definitely there was economic interest, at least in my village and with my family. So I know, like my father, he was born in Mardin, and then when they left to Syria, later, when in 2005 I tried to check about his paper registration, actually that they made him died, made him dead according to the registration in Turkey, in Mansouriye, in Yalim, which is today, because they can loot the family properties and all this stuff. And here is the scene from the Mansouriye. So here are some interesting photos about Muhammad al-Hakim Mosque or Marsi al-Hakim Church. And now, while I was searching for the Mansouriya genocide, I wanted to see that if there was already an issue of co-living together with the Muslims and Christians in this village. So I started to look for the manuscripts, and it's very interesting that that we have these Mansouriya manuscripts everywhere. For example, Church of 40 Martyrs, or like in Tur Abdin, in Mor Gabriel Monastery also. And the funny thing, for example, this is in Mor Gabriel, and this is in Zafaran, and then you can find the archive how it is mistreated. And I really wish that some serious attempt, because definitely they have a lot of very important stuff, and thanks to Benjamin, and I hope that we can have Ottoman Syriac scholarship talking about this archive. Anyway, the most important thing about Mansouriye, that we have the first female scribe from Mansouriye, and this is from Mor Gabriel Monastery. We have other manuscripts talking about Mansouriye and school in Mansouriye, and everywhere. For example, this is in Paris, and this colophon is now this from Zafaran, and all of them, they are talking about a big deal. It seemed that Mansouriye had a good chance for a golden history in the 16th century, and I'm working for my postdoc research in Graz University on the anaphora of Abdel Ghani Mansouri, that he was a Mafrian, died 1575, and actually that he had the longest liturgy, Syriac anaphora. And then I tried to find some kind of eschatological dimension for his text, and always you find it. So, for example, that we have the scholar Hans Rivers, that he talked about Jacob of Edessa and Testamentum Domini, and how the eschatological dimension might reflect a conflict already existing in the area. And I could find this in this text, and this is, for example, the incipit of the anaphora. And then I tried to search some of these, at least something written. So I went to the Armale, and to the Zafar 107, and then Abdel Masih Qarabashi, Muzliho, and then the Dolabani article, actually, which is for me the most fascinating work. So this is the Armale. So thanks for yesterday that they alluded to him, and he was as an eyewitness for his book Qusar fi Nakabat al-Nasara, the utmost of the Christian calamities. He has here alluding, so it's interesting that we are here in Germany and after 100 years, and here Father Armale, he's really accusing the German and the Austrian, and he said that these people are really involved, and especially here that he is talking about Austria, that they are claimed that they are Catholic and they have to protect us. Armale was very Catholic one. And he said that actually shame on them, they do nothing for us, and actually that they were closing their eyes, ignoring the fact of so-called genocides, killing, murdering, whatever, and they only care about their benefits. And ironically, it's like today. So many of these Oriental Christians, they really believe that West can help them, but it never happened, actually. And the first genocide for Mansouriya was in 1895. And it's really witnessed by Armale that, so we have the Dashiya, that they are the Arab tribes, that they moved, as we know from Dola Bani, they moved to Mansouriya. They were not the inhabitants of theirs, they were Arab tribes from Jazira, bin Umar, and then they came. So they were murderers, mercenaries, and then they came and they settled. So anyways, but there were the Kurdish, 5 minutes. And so they were the Kurdish that they wanted in 1895. The Dashiya, they didn't do that, but they took money. So regardless, for them is the jizya is the most important. I have to allude very quickly for those who are interested with the source for the Za'faran 107. We have a very interesting manuscript, and especially that here Patriarch Abdul Masih, actually that he is glorifying the regime, the Ottoman regime. And as we can read here that he is accusing the Armenians, yeah, so those Armenians, the rebellions, people that they were against the regime, and that's why that they had to deserve. And this is something interesting maybe to study. So even we have some people, because of course that he got something from the regime, because he got a Faraman, and he was for the first time the patriarch of the old Syrian, the Suryani Qadim. In 1915, Armel is describing it by details, and then they came, and he is mentioning even the names, they killed them. He's talking about one Syriac Catholic priest, and he's belonging to my family. So here Armel is talking that even the Syriac Orthodox Jacobi, that actually they helped, sometimes they cooperated with the regime or others to accuse their Catholic colleagues, but I doubt about it. Maybe Armale was very problematic with this issue, and he likes polemics. So he mentioned names. In Dmozli, also Karabashi, he is talking about this genocide, and especially that they killed them in the church, and they only left some women. Of course, they looted all their stuff, and no one, so this is the thing, no one really dared to go back to the village. So that's the thing, they did the massacre, and no one really dared to go back, because that was really horrific. The last thing is this article by Dola Bani, that his mother's side is from Mansouriya, so it seems that he has something of passionate. He has this article, which is a manuscript, and he talks about all these genocides and happened, and he talks about the Dashiya and their influence and role that to kill the people and to loot them and to do all this traffic. So those who are interested, maybe later when we publish this conference, that it was worth publishing this article. And then the thing that I'm going to share with you personally, and maybe with Professor Aydin, that I have to share with him, that during the Syrian war, this really influenced me. So I, especially when ISIS and maybe other groups, unknown groups, they kidnapped my bishop, whom I served as his secretary for many years. So when he was kidnapped and I was doing my PhD in Lebanon, this trauma came back to me, and I started to suffer from it. And those people that they know me personally, like my dear wife, she knows that I had always to see these terrible stuff of the genocide happened 100 years ago, always in my dreams. And my grandfather, that whom none of my family seen, only my father knew him, and I had to see him always in my dreams, and I don't know why. Sometimes that he has dirty clothes, he was suffering, and sometimes I see the bishop. So I'm sharing this personal feedback with you, that it's really very difficult, and especially if you are the third generation or second generation, and I'm pretty sure that many of them are here, that it's really painful and sad, and especially now when the tragedy is happening again, and all these feelings that we talked yesterday of mistrusting others, it's really harmful. So I would like to thank you so much.
And we are ready for your questions. Let's start here. You had your first, and then I'll go this way. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. One to Yaqro Ablahad and one to Ephraim. Ablahad, when media fell, then the regulars and the irregulars, I think, gathered together, decided where to go to Ibardo or Angel or both. And can you elaborate in this? Because there was an intent also to attack Angel, but they spared it, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. That the Mahmadis, of course, were involved, as you say. My second question is to Yaqro Ephraim. There is a gap, I think.
Which Ephraim?
You. Sorry.
The old one, but he's
The last one. Sorry. There is a gap, I think, in the chronicles of the patriarchs. You mentioned the Patriarch Abdul Masih. I am not sure then that there was an absence of patriarchat in Deir Zafaran during 1950. Between him.
I'm sorry.
Maybe
I'm
you can
talking here
elaborate.
about 1895. 1895. That's so that's maybe because I was in early. So this he is testifying about the 1895.
95, not 1915, because
No.
there was no patriarch at that time.
No.
in
I'm
Deir
talking
Zafaran.
about 1895.
Okay,
Abdul
that
Masih
was the
that
point, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let's put this in so that you could use it. Okay. Okay.
Shall we answer that?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Are you done?
I'm done.
Yes.
Well, concerning your question, it was planned for an attack on, simultaneous attack on both Eduardo and Angel. And actually the sources that I have searched through, they just told that the reason for why Angel also should be attacked is that it sheltered lots of Christian refugees also, and there was suspected lots of Armenians to be sheltered also in Angel. But for me, unknown reason, they concentrated on Eduardo, and I just analyzed it that the fighters of Eduardo were sent out to rescue people from being killing, and those who tried to flee the deportation convoys, they were rescued by these fighters of Eduardo. We know also that the fighters of Eduardo actually managed, they sent up to 300 men to save the people of Persia that they were attacked. They saved half of them, and the other half tried to seek shelter in other Kurdish villages, and they were hostages there. So I think the reputation of these hard fighters, let's say, could have been reason to focus on Eduardo at first priority, and after that they would move on to Angel. But since this took too long time and too much effort, they abandoned this idea of attacking Angel, and Angel was never attacked.
Well, thank you very much. We have this gentleman and then this lady. Yes, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for communications. I have two questions to Ephraim Yıldız. Dealing with Botan region, you mentioned that many times Jacques Rétoré. And my question is about the American missionaries. Because in the Blue Book, which was published in 1916, some pages are devoted by McDowell about the situation, the atrocities, including in Mansouriya and Botan. And my question is about maybe can we have some details about this important part of the document, the American Presbyterian. And the second question subsequently is about how Protestantism was introduced. It's one of a big question, because some of Hassana now in France and in Belgium it is in link with American missionaries and in link with those who were working in Urmia and Salamas. Thank you.
Yeah, can you have the microphone? Yes, thank you. This
Thank
lady
you
on
very
the
much
front.
for both questions. As far as the first part of the
and
question
then-
is concerned, they are not only the so-called the blue book, there are many other testimonies that are still untold. The thing is, as we were so limited with the time, I just focused on Jacques Pecqueray, who were one of the eyewitness testimonies in that region, and that's why I just focused on him. But let's concentrate on the second question, which is quite interesting, how the Protestant Church became a kind of important presence in the region, and how they came through to the Christians, because we have to underline a fact. We were since the separation considered a kind of people, very strange people. We were Christians, but we were not considered as real Christians. So when the Western world opened the door to the Eastern side, they came with special concrete, how would I say, projects. The manner of convincing our brothers, Syriac Orthodox or whoever, or Nestorians or Chaldeans, the manner was showing them the attractivity of being different and well paid. One of the main manner of dealing was, we are going to build your schools, we are going to offer you this, and we are going to offer you gold, and so on. And this is an attractive part of the whole issue, why Hassana is the case, a clear case. This was the way how they became Protestant.
Thank you very much. Yes.
This is for Ephraim Yildiz also. There's so many crypto-Christians in Turkey, and many Greeks, excuse me, Greeks and also Armenians that pretended to convert in order to save their lives. And I remember you saying about the priest telling them it's better to die as a Christian.
Yeah.
Didn't they ever consider, or are there examples of the Syrians where they considered at least pretending to be converted so that they can pass this period of genocide and then begin to live their lives again?
There are so many cases of those who converted to Islam in order to save their lives, and we have proofs of hundreds of families. Now they are just, they have now the courage to say that we are from the Assyrian origin. We have, in Diyarbakir, we do have more than 80 families actually who are saying, we are Assyrians, but we belong to the Muslim religion. So there were cases where the conversion was...
But did they ever, because the crypto-Christians still practice their Christianity, but underground?
There was a hard control. I can't be for sure, there might be several cases, but the main cases were, as the destroying machine was so hard, there was no chance that a community could have the elements of a cryptic community. This, like the case of the Jewish in Spain. This, I think, such a phenomenon, as I'm informed, hasn't been realized or hasn't taken place as an organized, for sure there were cases, that they were officially Muslims, but in their heart they were still Christians. But it endured only probably some decades, and then it was over. The second generation was still Muslim. This is the process.
Actually, there was a conference on Islamicized Armenians that was held at Boğaziçi University this past year for the first time. And that is something that will be built on. According to my conversations with Hrant Dink before he was murdered, he said that there were about probably 2 to 2.5 million Armenians who are Islamicized in Turkey today, in case you're interested. Yes, we have this gentleman, yes. And
my question is for Benjamin, but if I may add something to the previous conversation about Islamized Assyrian and crypto Christians. Well, if I can basically say that, I've come into contact with people that have told me that they were Assyrians and that their families converted to Islam. When I was in Siirt in 2002, I came across people from the village of Qutmas, which was a Chaldean Catholic village, and they told me that all of their ancestors had converted to Islam in 1915, and when I sort of poked and prodded and I tried to ask them, well, did any of your ancestors teach you any words in Assyrian? Did any of your ancestors tell you about Christianity? They told us, no, nothing. We're Muslims, we're Kurds, we support the PKK, we built a mosque in the village, we left the church alone, but we built a mosque in the village. We know nothing about when we were Assyrians and when we spoke Syriac and when we were Christian. Our elders told us nothing, and I think that's largely because of their isolation. And because they were so isolated in mountainous areas, a lot of them had no idea that the rest of the community survived and that they could have returned to the community. So they just accepted the new reality and they accepted their new lives. Now my question for Benjamin. I really enjoyed your paper. This list by Barsum Monofar of the 60 families in Adiyaman, are they only of Syrian Orthodox families, or does he also include families that were Protestant or Catholic? I think you mentioned that there was also a Syrian Catholic priest in Adiyaman. It'd be interesting to know.
Unfortunately, he doesn't differentiate between the different branches of the Syriani. So I don't know what the distribution between Catholic and Protestant, or Catholic and Orthodox was there, and it certainly doesn't appear in that list. In fact, the Catholics are mentioned only with respect to that one priest. So I don't really know much about Catholic community, unfortunately.
So maybe those 60 families are all Syriac.
They may all be.
So you might not have even mentioned the Syriac Catholic families or the Protestant families.
It's possible.
There's also going to be another book coming out in Turkish by Ayşegül Altınay and Fethiye Çetin on Islamicized Armenians and Christians. So we'll probably have more and more information on that very important group, because they don't belong anywhere at the moment. We do know, with the case of the Islamicized Armenians, they have a church now in Istanbul that they come to, but they are unfortunately excluded by the Armenians of Turkey, who think that they're converting back for profit again. I mean, so there are all these weird tensions that need to be overcome. Sorry, yes, and then the person.
So eloquent and detailed about 1915, but maybe for time you cut out 1914, some of you. I was wondering, what can you say about 1914 in terms of prior warning, negotiations with the state, assassinations or killings, and people going into labor battalions in preparation for the war?
Thanks. Anyone who wants to take that? Yeah.
I'll take it because mine's easy. 1914, Boris Bonaparte mentions that the war starts, but then he's quite explicit that the first indication that anything's going to happen is 1915, when that poster is put up in town, and there's this first warning that the Christians are going to be targeted.
Yes?
No, for me it's very easy and very clear. So the so-called killing in this village in Mansouriya was definitely in the 11th of June of 1915. Definitely there were always, so it was always up and down with the relation with the Muslim villagers. But if we can talk about massive killing, so it was in that couple of days, and they moved all of them to Mardin because it's only 3 kilometers, so they could defend themselves.
Adding to this, it's not only in 1914, you have to go far back in order to see the reality, which was just preparing the field from middle half of 1843 onward. There was continuously attacking different regions. The Bedr machine was still on the road. So this is probably many aspects, but for sure, officially, there were our clerical leaders. They were in contact with some Turkish leaders too, in order to avoid a kind of massacre. This is especially by the Jacobite Church quite visible in that sense. And even the so-called Nestorian Church was in touch in that, especially in 1914, in order to have a compromise and avoiding the massacres.
In that context, actually, what's important is the Ottoman policy to settle forcefully the Kurds in the 1840s and 50s, and that's followed by the 1858 private property law for the first time, which means that title deeds come, and then there is, of course, a lot of force against non-Muslims because they do not have as much political power as the rest. And that is when especially the monasteries start to lose a lot of their traditional lands because there are no title deeds associated with it. So I think that is probably how it all starts very early on and then gets worse, right? Yeah.